Well, I'm glad you guys are here tonight. It's kind of an off topic, if you will. When we kind of revamped the curriculum for Ratio Christi, we used to spend an entire semester just kind of walking through more philosophical issues, not even necessarily having to do with Christianity per se, but just philosophy in general. And as we redid the curriculum, it was decided to sprinkle these in throughout the years instead of spending a whole semester. Now some of you, if you're philosophy majors, would rather spend a whole semester on philosophy. But that's how we've chosen to do it. And so tonight, we're going to focus on a particular, kind of an overview, maybe if you will, of philosophical history, or at least the influence some key figures have had in Western thinking. And that's how I like to start off this lecture. You've probably seen lists or heard people have discussions about what figures throughout history have had the most influence in Western civilization. And usually they will narrow it down to philosophers, maybe some scientists, political thinkers, kings, possibly even Caesars, shaping Western society. But most of those, at least in the academic arena where this is studied, like history and the history of philosophy in particular, it's usually agreed upon the top three, okay? Well, first of all, everybody agrees that Jesus of Nazareth, whether you're a Christian or not, most everybody agrees that this individual, Jesus of Nazareth, has had the most influence on Western society over the last 2,000 years. So he's always number one, no matter who's making this list, he's always put as number one. I mean, for goodness sakes, we even have developed our calendar, right, based off of Jesus. So he's probably the most influential person in terms of shaping Western thinking. But then number two and number three is always Plato and Aristotle. So you've got Jesus, Plato, and then Aristotle. And I thought what would be good for us is to walk through, since we mostly focus on Jesus and Christianity in Ratio Christi, to look at number two and number three, to take a look and try to understand how Plato and Aristotle have shaped Western thinking. And it starts with thinking. I mean, that's what philosophy is all about, right? It's trying to think correctly, trying to understand things, figure things out through philosophical means. But these philosophical ideas trickle down and have a tremendous amount of implications in culture. Even though they start out as these kind of heady ideas and just people sitting around, you think of the meme here, just people sitting around talking, trying to think through things. But philosophical ideas have shaped and influenced Western civilization as those ideas trickle down to the general culture and then shape the ideas and the movements of that culture. So it's important, whether you're a Christian or not, I think it's important to understand Plato and Aristotle's main ideas and how those ideas have shaped Western civilization. The way that I want to start with this is to begin by thinking through one of the major issues that Plato wrote about. So I'm just kind of walk you through his thought process, kind of guide you through it, so to speak. So let's start by considering beauty, okay? Now we recognize as just human beings that different things have beauty, right? So you could say that there's a flower there that's beautiful, or you might see a sunset and describe that as beautiful. Architecture, maybe a painting, a person, right, we could say is very beautiful. So a lot of things have beauty, and Plato recognized that. But in his thought process, he realized that none of those things are beauty. All those things I described, and this is Plato's thought process, so I'm kind of speaking his thoughts out loud here. He recognized all those things have beauty, but none of them are beauty itself. And so he was trying to wrap his mind around beauty itself. What is beauty? Don't give me just instances or particulars of things that are beauty, but trying to ponder beauty itself. What is that? Long story short, we're going to fly through 2,000 years of Western thinking, so we're going to move along at a pretty fast clip. But Plato concluded, in his own mind, trying to understand this stuff, he concluded that beauty itself was something separate. That beauty itself must exist somehow separately from all the things that have beauty. If different things could have beauty, then beauty itself must be something separate from them. And I want to kind of walk you through how he came to this conclusion. In philosophy, we use a lot of thought experiments, right? So I'm going to give you like hypothetical situations, and this is what philosophers have done for thousands of years, including Plato, thought experiments to kind of flesh out these different ideas and come to hopefully true or correct conclusions. So here's how Plato came to this conclusion that beauty itself must exist as something separate on its own. He had this sort of thought experiment, right? He said, what if, for instance, everything that has beauty suddenly disappeared? Now, that would be almost impossible, right? If not impossible to make happen. But just as a thought experiment, let's say that this actually took place. Everything that had beauty was suddenly gone. Every beautiful person, every beautiful flower, every beautiful sunset. Again, this is impossible, but just imagine for a moment. All beautiful things are gone. Then you would ask the question, okay, if that happened, would beauty still exist? Now, you might disagree with him at this point. I'll give you guys a few minutes to discuss his thought process here soon. But Plato himself came to the conclusion that yes, beauty would still exist. Even if all beautiful things were gone, beauty would still exist because somehow it exists on its own as a universal truth. You might have heard the term form before, or absolute. Plato's forms, sometimes this is called. But he came to this conclusion that there are these forms or universal absolutes that exist on their own out there somehow. Beauty being one of these forms or universal truths. So the next question he had, again, we're just flying through his thought process here, is, okay, if beauty exists as this form or universal truth, then where does beauty exist? If it exists on its own, where is it located, if you will? We know flowers are over here and sunsets are up there and things that have beauty, but beauty itself, where does that exist? And the first thing you might think of is, well, it exists in our minds, right? It's an idea that we have, beauty. And that might be how a lot of people think today. You've probably heard the term beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? That's that type of mentality that beauty exists in our mind. But Plato rejected that idea, and I'll explain why. Plato said, no, that can't work. That doesn't work. Beauty can't just exist in our minds. And here's some more thought experiments that he used to flesh out this conclusion. He said, again, kind of like his other thought experiment, what if all humans suddenly disappeared? Right? What if somehow all the human beings were gone? Would beauty still exist? And he said yes. He thought it was the case that beauty would still exist. So our minds can't be where beauty is ultimately located. Yeah, we can have ideas about beauty, but that's not where beauty itself is located. It must exist in a more stable, permanent place. Our minds aren't stable enough, right? Because you can imagine a situation where all the humans died off for whatever reason. And he wanted to say that no, beauty would still exist even if there was nobody around to think it. There must be a more stable, permanent place. Another problem that he had with this idea that beauty just exists in our minds is the problem with beauty being in the eye of the beholder. See, he rejected this idea because he thought, and I think correctly so, that this leads to, or maybe just is part and parcel, part of, the idea of relative truth or subjective truth. So another problem then he had, Plato, with this idea that beauty just exists in our minds, is that then beauty could be different for different people. And he thought that was honestly ridiculous. He did not think that that was sustainable or made good, plausible sense. And I'll give you some thought experiments of how he kind of fleshed this idea or made fun of this idea or showed maybe a more philosophical way to say it is a reductio ad absurdum. He tried to show how thinking that beauty just exists in our minds reduces to absurdities, and therefore we should reject that idea. So another thought experiment, let's say I had some sort of mental problem, maybe this isn't as hypothetical. Let's say I had some sort of mental deficiency such that, for instance, I thought a pile of manure was beautiful. Let's say I thought that was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Now, if I had that sort of problem in my mind, and beauty was just in the eye of the beholder, then nobody could tell me that I was wrong, right? Because beauty's in that. If that's beautiful to you, then that's your truth. And if I don't think that's beautiful, then that's true for me. And he tried to show how this was a ridiculous position, and that when somebody makes a silly claim like that manure is beautiful, the most beautiful thing they've ever seen, we should be able to tell that person, no, they're wrong. We should be able to say more than, well, that's just your opinion, I have my opinion, you have your view, I have my view. Plato, at least, wanted to say, no, if somebody comes to a ridiculous situation or ridiculous belief like that, truth works in the sense that it's objective, and we should be able to tell that person that they're wrong. But if beauty just exists in our minds, we wouldn't be able to tell that person that they're wrong. Or another thought experiment, let's say some evil scientist put a drug in our drinking water so that tomorrow we all thought manure was the most beautiful thing in the world. Would that make manure beautiful? Plato wanted to say no, there must be some objective standards of beauty such that even if all humans believed tomorrow somehow that manure was beautiful, they would be wrong. So those are a couple of the reasons why he rejected this idea that beauty just exists in our minds, the eye of the beholder, so to speak. So he posited that beauty must exist somehow beyond our minds. Somehow beauty must exist objectively outside of our opinion, outside of our human views, so that if somebody thought, something gross was actually beautiful, you could say, no, they're wrong. So he described beauty, among many other things. I'm just using beauty because it's easy to kind of start the conversation with, and it's something we can all grasp and understand. But he would say beauty and other things exist as these objective, universal, absolute truths. Again, sometimes they're called Plato's forms. Okay? Now, he argued that since the physical world, including us, because as he saw it, we're part of the physical world is not stable enough. It's not a firm enough foundation for these types of truths. Because the physical world is always in flux, right? It's always changing. Our bodies are changing, flowers change, everything in the physical world is always in flux and changing. So it's not a permanent, stable enough foundation for these ultimate forms, these absolute truths. And so he posited that there must be then some transcendent realm, some immaterial realm where all these truths exist, an unchanging realm that's separate from the physical realm, which is always changing. There must be somehow out there a transcendent realm, an unchanging realm where all of these forms, if you will, exist. And they don't change. And so he was an immaterialist, right? A materialist believes that all that exists is the physical material stuff. Matter, atoms, electrons, tables, pointers, right? There's only physical stuff. So Plato was not a materialist. Plato would be classified as an immaterialist because he thought that there were some things that existed immaterially, including these forms in this transcendent realm. He went even further than this, though, and he said that this transcendent realm is more real than this realm, the physical realm. So he's got these two realms in his mind, right? He posited that there's the physical realm and this transcendent realm. And he thought the transcendent realm is more real, more fixed than this realm. This realm was always changing. In fact, he went so far as to say that this physical realm is just made up of shifting shadows of these forms in the transcendent realm. So he put a lot more emphasis on this transcendent realm and the truths within it. Okay? Transcendent realm is ultimate reality. That's what's permanent. That's what's real. The physical world was much less real, according to Plato. Physical realm, just shifting shadows. So again, go back to beauty. You know, you can destroy a beautiful flower or a beautiful bird or a beautiful person. So it's not as real because beauty itself can't be destroyed. It's permanent and unchanging. And so it's more real than the things that have beauty. So you can kind of see where he's going with this. Yes, it's kind of hard in our Western scientific culture nowadays to think like this because we are very influenced by the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and so we tend to think of the physical things are more real. If we can touch it, if we can experiment on it, we can see it with our eyes. But for Plato, it was just the opposite. The transcendent realm for him was actually more real than the physical realm because it could not be changed or destroyed. So I'm going to let you guys, if you're new to Ratio Christi, every few minutes we try to turn it over to you guys at the table to discuss for a bit. So I'll give you guys a few minutes to discuss his ideas, disagree, agree with it. Here are some questions to possibly get you started with. Do you think he was correct that beauty and other things are objective and exist beyond our minds? Or do you think he was wrong, that these things are just subjective? If you do think that they're objective, right, then where do they exist? So go ahead and discuss that for a few minutes. Okay. What we always say, at Ratio Christi is that these 4 or 5 minute discussion times hopefully are just the beginning, because I hate to cut you guys off because you're having such great conversations, but hopefully these are just the beginning of your conversations and you can stay afterwards and talk more or meet tomorrow, over coffee or something, get together and chat. But we're going to move on now, and I chose beauty because that seems to be one of the most controversial, and just listening to you guys, that rang true again, because especially in our culture, the way it is right now, it's very hard for us to not think of beauty being in the eye of the beholder. So it sparks some good conversation. But there's some other forms, right? Some other absolute truths that I think might be a little bit more easily, or you might more easily grant Plato's position on. So, for example, mathematical truths, right? So that would also be something where Platonists would say mathematical truths like 2 + 2 = 4. You can do that with a bunch of particular things, right? You can take 2 apples and 2 other apples and have 4. You can do that the whole. But the mathematical truth, 2 of anything + 2 of anything = 4, seems to exist independently of any particular things. And it seems to exist objectively as an objective truth. So that if somebody says something silly, like 2 + 2 = 5, you can say more than, well, that's just your view, I have a different view. You can say, well, no, you're technically wrong because this is an objective, absolute truth. So most people are more willing to grant mathematical truths than maybe truths about beauty. But another interesting one to talk about would be, and Plato does this quite often, is moral justice. So go through the exact same thing that we went through with beauty and just think about moral truth. Is moral truth something that just exists in our minds? So for instance, if let's say I thought rape was morally acceptable, can you tell me that I'm wrong about that? Or do you just have to say, well, that's your opinion, I have a different opinion? Or can you say, no, it's objectively true that rape is wrong? So you can go through the same conversation with moral issues. And Plato does this. Famously in the Republic, he uses Socrates often as his spokesperson. We think what he does a lot of times is Plato puts his own thoughts in Socrates' mouth. So for instance, if you read the Republic, Plato has Socrates going around asking people, really annoying people, what is justice? What is, just demanding people to explain to me, what is, do you think you understand what justice is? Tell me what justice is. And then everybody he talks to gives him certain instances of justice. Well, you see, justice is when this happens and then the courts decide, and that's justice. And then Plato, through Socrates, says, no, that's an instance of justice, but I want to know what justice itself is. But it's the same thought process as we went through with beauty already, so we won't go through it again. But what led Plato to this conclusion, though, is that he was convinced, like a lot of thinkers, that there must be some of these things that are objectively true. For instance, like beauty, mathematical truths, and, at least for Plato, moral truths. Because he was convinced that there must be an absolute fixed reference point to measure things by. Whether it's mathematical truths, you can measure truth and falsehood by, or truths about beauty or truths about morality. There has to be some sort of objective absolute standard so that we can measure things or discern whether things match up to that measurement or not. Because otherwise, he thought it would be absurdity just to have different opinions, just to have different mathematical views, different views about morality. He was convinced that no, there are objective truths about these things so that we can be right or wrong objectively about these things. Now you might be starting to see why people have elevated Plato and usually put him as number 2 in terms of people who have influenced Western thinking. So I'll give you an example of that. This is a quote from Alfred North Whitehead. He was a very famous European philosopher and then moved to America and became a philosophy professor at Harvard University. And here's a quote from Whitehead discussing how important Plato's thoughts have been in shaping Western thinking. This is what he wrote. Whitehead said, "The safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato." So what he's saying is that Plato's ideas really is in a sense, is what we've all been talking about the last 2,500 years. And all of our conversations, at least at the philosophical level, have just been footnotes to some of these main ideas, either agreeing or disagreeing with Plato. And I got to say, I agree with him. I mean, once you really understand Western thinking and where it came from, and even the conversations that we're having today about things, a lot of it goes back to these issues of relative truth versus objective truth. And how can there be such a thing as objective truth? What's the best explanation for that? I would say myself that Plato was very insightful. I would say that he was correct about a number of things. And most famously, so did Saint Augustine. Now, you might be familiar with Saint Augustine. He is probably the most influential Christian theologian, philosopher, thinker, whatever you want to describe him as, in the first 1,000 years of Christianity. So you think of, this Christian movement has been going on for 2,000 years, and St. Augustine is probably the most influential thinker in the first 1,000 years of the church. Augustine was he lived in the 300s, 400s AD, and he was heavily influenced by Plato. Now, he read a lot of the Greek philosophers, but he thought that Plato was the most insightful. And so what we have, and I'll try to explain to you how Plato's ideas as, morphed in and developed into Christian thinking through Augustine and others, then shaped the entire Western culture for the first 1,000 years. And this is, the history of philosophy that normally I would cover an entire semester. When I teach philosophy, when I used to teach it in Germany, and then for other schools, we would spend a whole semester walking through this history, and we're doing it all in one night. So we're just flying through the highlights, right? So what Augustine said is that Plato, though he didn't realize it, when Plato was describing this transcendent realm, what he was actually describing, according to Augustine, was the nature and mind of God. So this transcendent realm that Plato was describing, according to Augustine, was actually the mind or the nature of God. So these unchanging attributes of God, like beauty, moral justice, even mathematical, rational truth, all of that exists, yes, correctly, Plato is correct, in this unchanging realm, and that is God, who has these unchanging attributes and never changes. So you can see how similar that is maybe to a Christian understanding of things, where there's this physical realm that's always changing and shifting and in flux, but then you have a permanent realm, what Plato called like a transcendent realm. Christian, or Augustine in particular, would describe as the transcendent realm that doesn't change. Well, that's God, His thoughts and His nature. That's how these things can exist objectively out there and are unchanging. So how did that influence then Western thinking for literally the first 1,000 years? Well, what happened then is this sort of Platonic understanding of things, as filtered through Christianity, led Western culture to see the height of learning to be the study of these ultimate attributes, these ultimate truths. So the study of beauty, the study of moral justice. This was the height of learning, because there was a Platonic understanding that this was the ultimate. I mean, you can say it now in more Augustinian ways. The mind and nature of God is the ultimate thing to study. That's what's most real, right? Just like Plato said, the transcendent realm was most real. So that's the most important thing to study. That's why you have all these jokes about monks and the thinkers, the philosophers of the time sitting around thinking about these things, because that's what they were. That was the height of learning, was to try to understand these absolutes, these forms, if you will, these universals, these perfections. That was the height of knowledge. Contrast that with nowadays, where usually most people think the highest form of knowledge is scientific knowledge, right? And so we're trying to understand the physical realm as much as we can. Compare and contrast that with this more pre-modern way of thinking. That was the focus of the schools, and all of learning was on these immaterial things, these perfections, if you will, these universal truths. Now, this wasn't perfect, right? I don't want to paint this as a rosy picture, and they had it all figured out back then, and they were correct, because there were some instances in which they would take this thinking too far, okay? And you can see the danger here, right? If your focus is so much on the transcendent realm, you can, in a sense, ignore the physical realm. And if there's too much emphasis on the transcendent realm and just sitting around trying to study those things, you can neglect maybe some important things that are going on in the physical realm. And that did happen. There was also some Platonic thinking that went too far in the sense that some people started to think that everything that was physical was somehow tainted or evil. So everything that's physical is evil, and the transcendent realm is the only thing that's really good. And so this is where you have the development of some, monks who would not take pleasure in anything physical. We're going to sleep on uncomfortable beds. We're not going to eat any good foods. We're definitely not going to get married and have enjoyable sex, right? All those things are off limits because everything physical is evil. The only good things are these. And so you can see where this idea could be taken too far. Or the other extreme happened too with some sects, some groups. They would say, since the physical realm doesn't really matter, go ahead and do whatever you want with your body. And so they would engage in all sorts of things with their bodies, thinking that nothing physical matters, because the only thing that really matters is the immaterial realm, the transcendent realm. So you can see how these ideas can lead to some gross error, some gross mistakes. Now I want to shift gears. Like I said, we're just having to fly through this stuff, and I want to show you how Aristotle's thinking then influenced Western culture to move in a different direction. So sometimes I think of it like this, if Christianity is the main influence in Western society over the last 2,000 years, you can almost think of Christianity then as like this bowling ball going down a lane to hit the pins, right? And then the bowling ball has a spin on it. Maybe at first, or the first 1,000 years, it had a Platonic spin on it, so it was spinning this direction. And then you could say, just to summarize it quickly, the second 1,000 years of the church, so from 1,000 to 2,000, it had more of an Aristotelian spin on it, so it was spinning a little bit a different way. So the bowling ball is Christianity, but then the two different spins would be either a Platonic spin through Augustine or an Aristotelian spin through another key Christian thinker, who I'll explain here in a minute. So to understand the difference between Plato and Aristotle, I'm going to use this famous painting from Raphael. You might be familiar with this painting. It's the Renaissance artist Raphael painted this, and he tried to capture in one painting all of the famous Greek philosophers, right? And so somebody has done this where they put everybody's name next to the person, which is pretty cool. But of course, right in the middle, and what draws your eye's attention, is the two main Greek philosophers, which of course is Plato and Aristotle. Now artists are such, I wish I was a gifted artist, because artists have a way of communicating truth in a much more powerful, succinct way than somebody just standing up giving an hour-long lecture. Right? So Raphael was able to take all of these truths that I've trying to explain tonight about Plato and Aristotle, and he captured that in this painting. So let's zoom in and see how he communicated this through his art. So here you've got Plato and Aristotle, and unsurprisingly, Plato is pointing up, right? Because his emphasis is on the transcendent realm, right? Which it's not as though he thought it was above us, it was immaterial. But it's just easy to think of, it's up there, it's out there somewhere. It's not the material realm, it's some immaterial realm. So Raphael painted Plato pointing upwards. However, Aristotle, he paints, and his hand is more at waist level, maybe stomach level. And the reason he did that is because Aristotle disagreed with Plato, and he had more of a you could say, a balanced position between the transcendent realm and the physical realm. Okay, so he disagreed with Plato, and is probably number 3 in terms of influence in Western society. So it's important for us to now shift gears and understand why Aristotle disagreed with Plato, and then how that shaped the last 1,000 years of Western history, Western thinking. Okay, Aristotle, let's walk kind of through his thought process here. So he argued Plato was wrong to think that the physical world was merely shifting shadows, that only the transcendent realm was truly real. He thought Plato was wrong in this, and so he affirmed the importance of the physical realm. Aristotle did, okay? Now, importantly, he did agree with Plato that there were universal, absolute, objective truths, but he didn't think they existed in some transcendent realm. He thought, and he didn't really flesh this out very well, and this is where I think modernity got into trouble, and you'll see that as we walk forward through history. But Aristotle affirmed, again, that there are these objective truths of beauty, moral justice, mathematical truths, but they don't exist in some transcendent realm. They exist somehow in this physical realm. But he didn't really flesh out well how that was the case. He just stated it, if you will. And so that part of Aristotle's thinking isn't very clear. There's a sense in which then Plato's theory is a little bit cleaner. He's got 2 realms, which you can say, well, maybe that's not as clean because there's 2 realms. Aristotle's is cleaner because he's only got 1 realm. But there's a sense in which Plato's theory is a little bit cleaner because it's more easily obvious that this transcendent realm can be the location or the foundation for these objective absolute truths. Because it's harder, at least, and even Aristotle struggled trying to explain how these absolute objective truths could exist in the physical realm when the physical realm is always changing. How could these things be permanent and unchanging in the physical realm when the physical realm is always in flux? But regardless, this is how he disagreed with Plato. He said that Plato was wrong to disregard the physical realm, so Aristotle emphasized nature. He spent a lot of time himself. I mean, there's a sense in which he was the first scientist, in a sense. We don't want to use that term anachronistically, but he spent a lot of time studying nature, insects, animals, trying to understand the physical realm. Whereas in a Platonic way of thinking, you just don't do that. There'd be no reason to. The same reason why if you want to study, let's say, horses, you don't go around studying the shadows of horses, you study actual horses, right? Well, in a Platonic way of thinking, you don't study actual horses, you study the idea of horseness. I know that sounds really foreign to us nowadays, but in a Platonic way of thinking, that makes a lot of sense. You don't study shifting shadows, you study the real thing. Horseness, what it means to be a horse. The idea of horse, not horses itself. But this is where Aristotle was different. Aristotle thought, no, it was important to study the physical realm as well. So we want to see how Aristotle's thinking influenced the greatest, most influential thinker of the second 1,000 years of Christianity. This is no other than Thomas Aquinas, right? And just to give you, I mean, you might think some of this stuff is subjective. How do we know who is the most influential thinker? Or how do we know who influenced Western civilization the most? Well, here's maybe more of an objective way to rank these things. So more PhD dissertations have been written about Aquinas' work than any other topic in Western society. So there's just maybe an objective measure of how influential Aquinas' thinking has been as a philosopher and a theologian. So we need to discuss Aquinas and how Aristotle's ideas influenced him and then through him impacted all of Western society. Interesting story, we won't spend a lot of time on this, but Aristotle's works were actually lost in the West for hundreds of years. They were kept alive in the East by Eastern scholars and then ultimately by Muslim scholars. When I say kept alive, it was that before a printing press, it was that copying process. Just like the New Testament had to be copied and there were copying mistakes, but then if you take the different copies, you can look at, see where the mistakes were and recreate the original. The same thing is true with all ancient documents, including Aristotle's works. And Aristotle's works were pretty much lost in the West, but copiers and scholars in the East had continued copying Aristotle's works. And in the 1100s, Aristotle then was rediscovered in the West. And it caused a lot of controversy because the Platonic way of thinking had really engulfed all of Western society. All of Western thinking was more in a Platonic sense. And so when Aristotle was rediscovered in the West in the 1100s, it really shook things up and influenced, and the main proponent of this Aristotelian way of thinking was Thomas Aquinas. So let's talk a little bit about Aquinas. Now in school, when he was a younger man, you might like this, his nickname was the dumb ox. Thomas Aquinas was known as the dumb ox. Why the dumb ox? Well, first of all, he was a big guy, as you can see from the picture, so that's why he was the ox. And then he was very shy. He was very quiet. He hardly ever talked as a young person, as a student. And so, unfortunately, like what happens with a lot of introverts, people just thought he wasn't very intelligent because he never said anything. How would you know? So they just assumed he wasn't very intelligent. So they called him the dumb ox. But he proved them wrong in the end because his writing is absolutely incredible. He wrote so much and has had such a profound impact in the thinking of Western society. So not so dumb after all. As I keep saying, he was more aligned with Aristotelian thinking than Platonic thinking. And so therefore he, just like Aristotle, had a better balance between the transcendent realm and the physical realm. Okay? Now I want to take a little bit of a detour here and just talk about something that's a bit unique to Aquinas. And it's the way that he described how truth comes from God. Okay, so he was a Christian thinker, of course. But many people would say, better than any other Christian thinker, he combined or helped us understand what we can learn from God's book, Scripture, and what we can learn from God's what's called general revelation. So how God communicates to us through creation or through nature. So he and others use this term, you might have heard these before, God's general revelation and God's special revelation. And this isn't exactly unique to Aquinas, but he fleshed it out really well. So he's well known for fleshing out these ideas well, and probably had the best balance between these two things than any other Christian thinker. He's kind of a high water mark in that regard. So he would explain, like in general revelation, how God reveals truth to us, moral truth, reason and logic, grammar, language, how communication works, all this stuff. You don't need the Bible to know all these things, right? You can even know about God a little bit, what he's like, that he exists, some of his attributes from creation. Almost think of it like art, right? If all you had was somebody's artwork, well, you can make some conclusions about what the artist is like from their art. Similarly, we can look at creation, what God has made, and make some conclusions about what God is like based on what he's made. And this is all stuff that we can know and learn that's, in a sense, revealed to us by God, but generally. We don't need the Bible or any special revelation from God to know these things. Whereas then special revelation would be where God steps into history and communicates directly, what's called special revelation. So whether he communicates audibly to a person or through Scripture, that would be what's described. So both of them are revelation from God. It's just that they come in different forms. So I want to turn over to you guys now to discuss a little bit more at your table. And I want you to discuss these two types of revelation. And here's the question to get you going. A couple questions to get you going. Which do you think is superior? Or maybe better, in what ways do you think general revelation is superior to special revelation, vice versa? And overall, which one is more superior? And why? So maybe now that you know the questions, which one is superior? Are they superior in different ways? Why? Is one of them more superior overall than the other? Then I'll leave it here so to help remind you what the two are. So go ahead and discuss for a few minutes at your table. Now the reason that I took this little sidetrack, I guess, is just to show you an example of how, when somebody like Aquinas has a better balance overall between the transcendent realm and the physical realm, it fleshes out and has implications then for thinking like this. Because he has a better balance between the physical and the transcendent realm, he was able to better see then how God communicates through both, so to speak. So through the physical realm, God is communicating generally via general revelation, and then directly from the transcendent realm, God speaks, if you will, directly from the transcendent realm. So there's things through the physical realm that we can know, truths that we can know, but then there's some truths that we can know only if God directly reveals them to us through some sort of special revelation. So I'm just fleshing out and kind of showing you how his overall better balance between the physical realm and the transcendent realm led him to some of these, what I think are good conclusions and understanding of how things work. So there's a sense in which then I would say there's a sense in which philosophy is just the study of general revelation then. So philosophy, we're using our minds, we're looking out at things, reality, trying to understand it as best we can. And so there's a sense in which philosophy is the study of general revelation, and then theology is the study of special revelation. And this is exactly what Aquinas would say too. And why, this is what confuses a lot of folks, but this understanding then of how these two function together is why Aquinas would say that philosophy is the handmaiden or servant of theology. So even think about maybe in your own churches today how much philosophy is looked down upon and philosophy is just viewed as worthless. And there's a whole history of why that's come about and why most Christians think that today. But Aquinas was just the opposite. Aquinas had a lot of respect for philosophy because I think he had a better balance here, and why he explained philosophy as the servant to theology. Now he did think that theology was superior, and he thought that overall special revelation is superior, and I overheard a lot of your conversations as to why that's the case. It's more direct, it's more explicit, right? There's less room for misinterpretation because God is communicating directly, where there's a lot more, interpretation has to take place at both levels, right? But more interpretation has to take place here. It's kind of like, again, go back to the artist, where you're looking at the artist's art versus talking to the artist directly, okay? So there's a sense in which special revelation is superior, but, and Aquinas points this out really well, there's a sense in which general revelation comes first. Not in superiority, but comes first in terms of the order of knowing things. So we, just as humanity, just as human beings, you can think about a person growing up and learning these things, or just humanity in general, right? We first learn these things and understand these things, and actually general revelation, if we're interpreting it correctly and understanding it correctly, points us to special revelation and can help us, using these things, can help us ascertain what really is special revelation from God. Because, obviously, as you know, there's a lot of messages, or a lot of people claiming to have messages from God out there. Not all of them are true. Some of them are lying or just mistaken. And so these truths can help us ascertain what really is special revelation from God. But then once we're convinced, or once we know that something really is from God, then there's a sense in which it is superior than this. So again, that's kind of a balance that I think Aquinas can help us wrap our minds around, and how these different revelations from God help us in our knowledge and understanding of things. Okay, well, let's get back on track then and trying to parcel out how this shaped Western civilization then. So here, just again, if this is helpful to you, you've got Plato over here, right, in his Platonic transcendent realm, influencing Augustine for the first 1,000 years. And then you've got Aristotle's thinking influencing others, of course, but the most well-known one, Thomas Aquinas, shaping things, how things played out in Western society for the next 1,000 years. Okay? Well, because Aquinas was more influenced than by Aristotle, as I keep saying, he had a better balance between the transcendent realm and the physical realm. And so he shifted more and more emphasis on the physical realm. So remember, in the past, the height of learning in the Platonic era, if you will, the height of learning were these universal absolutes like beauty, truth, morality, mathematical truths. But now, as things were shifting to have a more Aristotelian flavor to it, more and more emphasis was placed on studying the physical realm, studying the physical world. And what do you think happened then, eventually, as these ideas became more and more influential in Western society? More and more time was spent studying the physical realm. Well, what happened is exactly what you're probably thinking. That's when we had our huge explosion in science, because now we're studying the physical realm. And the first big movement in this is, that's why it's called Aristotelian scholasticism, because it was shaped by this movement in the West back to more of Aristotle's way of thinking. And then just boom, 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 movements built on one another down to the scientific revolution and what some people call the Enlightenment of the 1700s, because now we're focusing on the physical realm. And that's why people say that Plato and Aristotle have had such a huge influence on Western thinking, because it led to these shifts in the culture and what was going to be focused upon. Now, the early scientists, when they started studying the physical realm, a lot of their initial motivation was to learn about the transcendent realm through the physical realm. Again, go back to that general revelation versus special revelation dichotomy. But a lot of the early scientists, their main motivation in studying the physical realm was to learn more about these absolutes, these truths. And so they even thought of and that's why astronomy was one of the first sciences that was really focused on, because again, not only did they think it was just, that's the heavens, that's a more spiritual place, but no, what they thought they saw in the heavens was more mathematical purity, more unchangeableness. Everything down here is in flux, but at least the heavens, the planets and the stars and such, that seems to be more fixed or closer to the unchanging transcendent realm. But again, the motivation was to study the physical realm, to understand God's mind, God's nature, those absolutes better. So you've got quotes from some of the early scientists like Johann Kepler. He wrote, I was merely thinking God's thoughts after him as he's studying science, astronomy, the planets. Since we astronomers are priests of the highest God in regard of the book of nature, This goes again back to general revelation, special revelation. It benefits us to be thoughtful, not of the glory of our minds, but rather above all else, the glory of God. And so they weren't thinking of themselves as the ultimate, right? They were thinking of God's mind was the source of these truths. But if we could study His art, study His creation, we can know His truths or know God's mind better. So that was some of the early motivation. But even this was a lot different than the Platonic way of thinking, where you just study these things themselves, not how they appear in the physical realm, but just mathematical truths and beauty and morality itself. So this was a huge shift. And I think it's a shift that we can really celebrate and get behind. You know, the birth of science and the discoveries that we've made, I think, is something that we should really celebrate. But just like in the Platonic way of thinking, there were some extremes within that, and you can see how the Platonic way of thinking can lead to some negative consequences if taken too far. Similarly, and this happened, as I understand it, in Western society, putting too much emphasis on the physical realm has its problems too. So one of the things that came about when we had so much success in science, so much success studying the physical world, and success, but I mean of technology, medicine, all these things that we can really celebrate, I think. But when we had so much success with our science, I think it gave us a little bit of a pride about our own reason. I think it boosted our own thinking. And this is often how modernism is described. Modernism is described as this era, especially when you get to the Enlightenment, of optimism. Like, we're going to be able to figure out everything. I mean, we've just made so many discoveries, and we're just figuring everything out at lightning speed. There's going to be a couple, in a few decades, we're going to have it all figured out. And just this idea that we can figure it all out on our own took over. Another thing that eventually came from this shift, focus onto the physical realm, is at least some key thinkers started to think that the physical realm is where all the answers could be discovered. That all the answers about life, meaning, purpose, morality, beauty could be found in the physical realm. That really the physical realm was the ultimate. See how this is different than the Platonic, where the transcendent realm is the ultimate real. The thinking shifted, if it went too far, in that the physical realm is the most important. It's the only thing that is really real. Where the opposite was true in a Platonic way of thinking. So you could almost think of it like this, almost think of it as like a pendulum shift, right? Where maybe in this era, this Platonic era, there was too little emphasis on nature, and so we swung probably through the right balance somewhere in here. And if you want to argue if Aquinas had the right balance or not, Aristotle, had the right balance or not, but somewhere in here, I would say there is the right balance between the transcendent and the physical realm. But the pendulum swung through that balance, and then by the time we get into the Enlightenment, I would say there was too much emphasis on nature. So we went from too little to too much. Ultimately to the conclusion that there just is no transcendent realm, right? That all that exists is the physical, material universe. And there is no transcendent realm. There is no transcendent truth, which I think is a mistake. I think that's going too far in that direction. And this goes back, again, I feel bad because we're just flying through Western philosophy here, Western thinking. But I keep saying eventually the conclusion that arrived at, eventually what happened then is, just like Aristotle struggled, even though Aristotle believed that there were absolute objective truths, he believed somehow they existed in the physical realm. That's kind of what began here as well, is when the emphasis began to be too much on the physical realm, at least at the beginning, it was thought that the ultimate truth was there in the physical realm. But they ran into the same problem that Plato had pointed out 2,500 years earlier, that the physical realm just doesn't seem to be a stable enough foundation for these objective truths. And so eventually the conclusion that came out of modernity, that came out of the Enlightenment, was just what Plato, in a sense, had predicted. That if you're going to try to locate these absolute objective truths in the physical realm, it's not going to work. And so eventually, not only was the transcendent realm discarded, but then, because all we were left with is the physical realm, these objective absolute truths were also discarded. And so then there was a rejection of objective beauty, objective morality, and we haven't dropped out the belief in objective mathematical truths, but that is a direction that some have pushed it. That, again, these things are just in flux as well. So you can see now why a lot of people say all of these conversations and discussions and philosophical movements are just footnotes to Plato, because there's a sense in which he saw this coming, if you will, or saw that this was where things would go if we put too much emphasis on the physical realm. Because that's where postmodernity went then. Postmodernity, after this, came to the conclusion that there is no objective truth, that truth is just relative. So yeah, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. That is a postmodern way of thinking. Truth is relative. If manure is beautiful for you, then hey, that's your view. That's your worldview. That's your opinion, right? If I find manure not to be beautiful, well, that's my worldview, right? We all just have different worldviews. There's no objective truth, and that's where we're at in our culture now. But you can kind of see where this came from as you walk through these different shifts in emphasizing the transcendent realm versus emphasizing the physical realm. So sometimes I like to do it this way. You guys have probably seen me or seen this slide that I've developed before, where in the pre-modern era, people thought that absolute truth came from the transcendent realm. It's up there somehow, you know what I mean? In modernity, Aristotle's influence through Aquinas, at least at first in the modern era, the thinking was that absolute truth is found in physical nature. And the truth I'm talking about here is like morality, meaning, purpose, love, beauty, because certainly, everybody believes that there are truths, facts about nature, right? Scientific facts. But what I'm talking about are these types of truths. So early in modernity, the idea was that these universal truths of beauty and morality could be found in physical nature, but that fell apart, just as Plato pointed out it would. Aristotle never really had a good solution for how these truths could be in the physical realm. And so eventually modernity rejected absolute truth, objective truth altogether, and that's how we found ourselves in this postmodern way of thinking, where truth is subjective. So you have subjective morality, subjective views of beauty. You can never say that somebody's wrong about beauty. It's just that's their view, and you can't say somebody's view is wrong. That's their truth. And so in postmodernity, it's more the idea that truth somehow is inside of you through your view, your understanding of things, or your choices. So this is, in a very general, broad sweep, 3 eras then of Western history. As I keep saying, the artists do a much better job packaging these things and communicating them. Us philosophers, we spend an hour now boring you with the details, but artists like Raphael can communicate these very powerfully, more succinctly through their art. And nowadays, that's often done through our modern forms of art, like movies. So I want to show you a movie clip where a modern-day Raphael is using his movie to communicate the same ideas that Raphael was communicating, 500 years ago. Okay, this idea, and good artists, and movie writers and directors and good artists even today, they understand where our thinking has come from, and they understand these influences. And they will put these ideas in their art or in their movies, because they know these ideas is what have shaped our thinking over the last 2,000 years. So one of my favorite movie directors is Christopher Nolan, and he studies philosophy. He is very well known. He describes himself as a postmodern movie director, but he has a good understanding of where our society has come from, and so in his movies, he'll put these ideas in his art, in his movies. And I'm going to show you a clip from one of my favorite Christopher Nolan movies, Interstellar. And what he does is he will have one actor voice this position, okay, more of a modern way of thinking. And then he has, it's Matthew McConaughey, okay? So Matthew McConaughey will be the spokesperson for modernity. And then he has Anne Hathaway in this clip be the spokesperson for modernity. So the truth is more inside of us. And so you'll see in the clip how these two ways of thinking are illustrated through these two characters. And good artists do this. They communicate these ideas very powerfully through their art. So let me show you this. It's only like 4 minutes, and then we'll be done. Now the context here, if you've never seen the movie, and this won't ruin anything for you, but the context is that Earth is dying, and we as humans, we need to go and find a new planet to live on. And these guys are up in a spaceship, and they only have enough fuel in their spaceship to go to one more planet. But there's 2 potential planets that they could go check out to see if would be a good new home for humanity. They only have enough fuel to go to one of them, so they're going to have a conversation, an argument about which planet they should go to. And Matthew McConaughey is going to argue from a more scientific, modernity position, where Anne Hathaway is going to come from more of a postmodern way of thinking. And I'll put the subtitles on in case the volume's not loud enough. You can. Sorry. You might even walk away from that thinking that, okay, in Anne Hathaway, we see a little flavor of pre-modern, transcendent realm, but that's not really the case, because it's vastly different than the pre-modern transcendent realm idea. She's thinking more that she needs to follow her heart. We don't clearly. Matthew McConaughey represents modernity. There is no such thing as love. It's just a chemical reaction that evolution selected for because it led to greater chances of survival and reproduction. That's clearly modernity. But then Anne Hathaway, she represents post-modernity, not pre-modernity, post-modernity, in the sense that love has got to be real because we feel it in our hearts. We just know it's true, and so it's this internal, subjective understanding of things, and we've got to follow it even if we don't understand it. So we're going to take an irrational leap of faith and just believe that love is real without any rational foundation or explanation, and that's much more of the postmodern wishful thinking that she represents. So I'm over 8:30 already, so thanks for being patient with me, and appreciate you guys coming tonight.